record, so this one will be recorded and we'll have it available on our website. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to our director, Janine Benner.
Thank you, Jenny. Good morning. My name is Janine Benner, and I'm the director here at the Oregon Department of Energy. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone who's taken the time to join us this morning to learn more about the corrective action plan and the risk assessment submitted by Chemical Waste Management. We appreciate your interest, and we hope that you'll share your thoughts with us today or as a written comment by November 8th. This is an unprecedented situation for everyone involved, and hopefully one that won't ever be repeated. At ODO, our priority is protecting the health and safety of the chemical waste management employees and the folks who live around the Arlington landfill. And I can assure you that is what drives Max, Jeff, and their colleagues at ODO's Nuclear Safety and Emergency Preparedness Division. And now I'd like to introduce Max Woods. He's the new director of that division. Some of you might remember Ken Niles, who retired last month after a 31-year career in nuclear safety at ODO. Max comes to us from ODO's siting division, where he also worked at the nexus of energy, land use, and environmental protection. Thank you. And now I'll turn it over to Max.
Great, thank you, Janine. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Had to get a quick video feed check there. Well, I wanted to thank you, Janine, for the introductions there, and thanks to everybody who's joined us on the WebEx meeting here today. And as a note, tonight at 6 p.m., starting at 6 p.m., we will be hosting an in-person meeting, a very similar presentation, the same materials essentially. Tonight, though, in Arlington at the local high school, at the Arlington High School football stadium. So we'll have social distancing, safety measures established the outside, but myself, Jeff, my colleague, and Jenny Kalas will be there in person to do a similar presentation. So of course, if anybody on this phone is interested in coming out again and listening to the same materials or meeting us in person, asking questions, you can do so tonight at 6 at the Arlington High School football stadium. As Janine mentioned, I wanted to thank everybody for joining us. And again, I've taken over for Ken Niles, who you may have met. And after his service ended in retirement at the end of August, I was fortunate enough to be selected as the new assistant director and manager of the Nuclear Safety and Emergency Preparedness Division. When I come to this job, I come to this matter with open eyes and open ears. I've been doing my best to learn about the issues, and just like everybody on the line is doing right now, reviewing the proposed corrective action plan and risk assessment that have been provided by Chemical Waste Management. And I can attest that we at ODO, and in particular, the person you're going to hear from next, Jeff Burright, and our colleague Tom Cecilia, who's back in the office, are experts in this field. They've been involved with the corrective action plan and with the incidents at Arlington since the beginning. And so I feel fortunate to be surrounded by experts who have been involved since the beginning and provide their knowledge in the presentation you're going to see next, but also as subject matter experts on the effort to establish the right pathway forward for what's happened at Arlington. I have deep respect for both Jeff and for Tom for their knowledge and expertise, and so I just wanted to make sure that that is aware that we have good knowledge on our side working on this matter. So we're here today. We'll share the information about the corrective action plan and the risk assessment. We're answering any questions you may have. And as Janine mentioned, we're also in the middle of a public comment period. And so at the end of the presentation, there will be more information on how to submit public comments. And we certainly hope that you will do so, submit comments to us. And ultimately, at the end of the comment period, and after we've conducted our own technical assessment, we have to make a decision. As Janine mentioned, our decision must be based with a priority on the health and safety of the employees and the local residents in the community, and be based in science. So we will not make that decision until all the comments have been received and reviewed, and we've conducted our own technical review of the documents. So again, thank you very much for participation. We'll answer questions you have at the end. And again, we'll be in Arlington tonight for a similar presentation should you choose to go again. And with that, I will pass it over to my colleague, Jeff Burright, for the presentation. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you. Am I coming through okay?
Loud and clear.
Looks good.
Great. Thank you. Again, my name is Jeff Burr. I'm with the Nuclear Safety Division here at the Oregon Department of Energy. Some of you who are participating now may, if you were at the meetings back in March, may have remembered that I was there with Niles. And before I get into the presentation, the first thing I want to do is acknowledge some of the things that I heard when I was at those meetings in Condon and in Arlington. I heard disgust with the fact that this happened, and I share that. I heard frustration, and I feel that too, although maybe in different ways than some of you may be feeling it. And I heard concern, not just for all of you who are here participating today, for the workers out at the site and the people who live there in the town, but for people long into the future. And I heard concern for the quality of the air and the water. I also heard concern about how a risk might be perceived by people outside of the community. So for all of those things, I personally just want to say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that you have to be here and dealing with this. I'm sorry that it's something that we could not prevent. And our agency is responsible for enforcing the laws as they concern radioactive waste disposal. I wish that meant that we could prevent the law from ever being broken, but that's not the case. Still, I regret that we didn't know about this sooner. As I said to you the last time when I spoke in front of the community, we do have to own our part in all of this, because this all happened, I believe, because our rules were misinterpreted. And the expectation of what was allowable was incorrect. And there's more that we can be doing now to perform education and outreach, and we're doing that. And I'll be talking about that. One of the outcomes of this event is that we've gotten better at making sure the law won't be broken again. And Waste Management, the company, has also gotten better too, via some real tangible changes to how they're doing business going forward. And I'll be talking about that this morning as well. But as Max and Janine said, we're here because a decision has to be made. That decision is what is the best and safest thing to do about the waste that was discovered to have been disposed in the landfill contrary to Oregon law. There are several you can look at what best means. For my part, I consider the best and safest outcome to be the one that causes least harm. And so that's the lens that I'm bringing to this with the information that I'm going to be presenting to you from the risk assessment and the corrective action plan. Big picture, what I have to communicate to you is good news and bad news, and they're both the same news. And that is that the waste that was disposed is not a high enough concentration, and there wasn't enough of it to warrant the risk that would be involved for digging it back out. And the information I'm going to present from the risk assessment and the corrective action plan support that case. And I'm going to do the best I can in the time that I have available to explain what those reports contain and then to answer questions that you might have. With that, I'm going to begin the presentation here. If you'll give me just a moment. Is it coming through?
Yep, that's good, Jeff.
Okay, thank you. Let's start with a reminder of what happened. It was a problem. About a year ago, we received notification from a citizen in North Dakota that there was potentially some radioactive material being disposed at an Oregon landfill. We conducted an investigation. We reached out to Waste Management because they do large, and came to discover that yes, in fact, there was waste from the Bakken oil fields that had been disposed in the chemical waste management of the Northwest landfill in Arlington between 2016 and 2019. About 1,285 tons or 2.5 million pounds is the total estimated amount that was disposed. And we determined based on the available data that waste did exceed our definition of radioactive waste, which is prohibited from disposal in the state. The average concentration of radium-226, which is the nuclide that we're regulating in this case, was 90 picocuries per gram, so trillionths of a curie per gram. And that's just a measure of its radioactivity. To, depending on how you look at the data, potentially as high as around 130 peaks per gram, against the threshold standard of 5 here in the state. It's estimated that the total waste was about 6,400 cubic yards, disposed across 36 acres of the landfill at varying depths. At what we understand is the shallowest it could possibly be today is 7 feet, all the way down to 50 feet below the current level of where the landfill is. Oops, excuse me. So we had a couple of first priorities. One was to cut off the source of the waste coming in, and that happened immediately. Second was to consult with the Department of Environmental Quality and the Oregon Health Authority, as well as use our own information about the waste. We also talked to the state of North Dakota, the state of Kentucky, who'd had something similar happen before, to come to a determination that in the immediate moment, there was no threat to workers, to the public, that we had time to take a step back and really think about what the right move forward would be. So we did that, made that determination. We then issued a notice of violation to the chemical waste management landfill in February of this year. And as part of that notice of violation, we required the landfill company to produce the documents that we're here to talk about today, which were released for public review on September 8th. And as was mentioned, when those documents were released, that began a public comment period that is open until November 8th. I wanted to give you just a familiarity with what this waste was. About 80% of the waste was known to be filter socks, which is what you can see, excuse me, here pictured. When you buy those clean, or when you buy those new, they're white, and they become loaded with material. Basically, what they do is filter out dirt from underground out of water. And this is that accumulated dirt, which has some natural radioactivity in it. Disposal of these socks has been a problem around the country, especially in the West, as fracking has taken off as an industry in the last decade or two. This has been a problematic waste to find a home for. I'm throwing around this term T-norm, or you've seen it there in the presentation. Some of you may remember from this spring, what we were talking about there. Technologically enhanced, naturally occurring radioactive material. Now, why do we call it technologically enhanced? Well, there is radioactivity around all of us. It's in the dirt. You can find it in bricks. You can find it in nuts and potatoes, et cetera. There's a natural concentration of radionuclides all throughout the earth. However, when there are human activities, such as fracking, that serve to concentrate those nuclides, that becomes then technologically enhanced, or if they bring it closer to where people can come into contact with it. And the process involved in fracking, as I understand it, you inject water into the ground to fracture the earth, and then they pull back out the water with oil and gas. And that water, when it comes into contact with the subsurface, can sometimes dissolve and bring back minerals, and those minerals can have natural radioactivity in them. So you've pulled radioactivity from a large area of the earth, you've brought it up in the liquid, and then you filter out that water so you can reuse it. So you've served to then concentrate some natural radioactivity from the earth. And that's what we're really talking about here. Not only can it be in the filter socks, that was 80% of the waste, it can also line the inside of pipes, so pipe scale, or be a sludge that settles down at the bottom of tanks and then is cleaned out. But it's all basically the same stuff. The reason that we regulate T-norm, and the reason why it is potentially a health concern, is that when you concentrate natural radionuclides that come from the uranium and thorium series, uranium is on its way to becoming lead 4 billion years from now. But on the way, it turns into different things. And each time it turns into something new, it lets off a little bit of energy. And that energy, if we're too close to it, or if we inhale or ingest a particle that then transforms into something else. So radium-226 is what's pointed there in the arrow. That's what we are regulating. One of the big reasons that we're concerned about it is that it turns into radon. Radon gas is something that a lot of people have to manage in their homes, in their basements, because from what we know of the data, it is a contributor to lung cancer. So that's something that we are concerned about. There are also other daughters of radium that have different types of radioactivity, but that's why we care about TNORM. Here's some data that we gathered from the state of North Dakota, which provided or was the source of most of the TNORM waste that was disposed here in Oregon. And what you can see here is a graph of the concentrations of radium in the waste that we've extrapolated based on the data that we got. It's not perfect, but it gives a good sense of how hot this stuff was radioactively. There you can see circled that 5 picocuries per gram is the base threshold in Oregon, where if you're below that, we don't call it radioactive waste. It can be disposed legally in the state, but if you're above that, that's when it gets trickier. I'll just note that of the concentrations you can see on the screen there are landfills in other states where it would be legal to dispose of waste at this concentration. However, Oregon, it is not. Speaking of that, talking a little bit about Oregon's radioactive waste law, there was a statute that was passed in the 1970s that said, essentially, you shall not establish a waste disposal facility for radioactive materials. Pretty basic rule. However, because there's a little bit of radioactivity in everything, it was left to our agency and the Energy Facility Siting Council to develop rules to define what specifically was meant by the radioactive waste that is prohibited from disposal in the state. And like I said, there's that 5 picocurie per gram threshold for radium, but there is a secondary threshold where we consider what the risk would be if you were to take a given waste, spread it out in your backyard, and build a house on it. Would there be an unacceptable health risk? But the main point here is that Oregon set a standard for itself that said, we don't want this kind of waste in our state, whether you could dispose of it safely in a landfill or not. And so that's why we're all here. So as I said, we issued the notice of violation to Waste Management. We determined there was no immediate threat. But as I mentioned to people who were there back in the spring, we were still left with some longer term questions. Should the waste be exhumed or should it be left in place? If that waste remains, what kind of monitoring is required to make sure that there won't be a problem in the future? And then what changes need to occur in the way the landfill operates and the way we operate to prevent something like this from happening again? And documents that we required Waste Management to develop were intended to support an answer to these questions. Here you can see the public process that we've been undertaking to reach a solution or resolution to this issue. We issued the notice of violation in February. We had the public meeting on March 4th, I believe it was. And then from there, the Chemical Waste Management Landfill contracted with some technical experts in this field to develop a risk assessment, which looks at the risk of digging it out versus leaving it in place, as well as the risk from the original disposals over that 3-year period. And then a corrective action plan to develop a preferred alternative for what to do and to think about the preventative measures. We worked with Chemical Waste Management over the last several months to make sure that the assumptions that were being made in that document and the technical methodology passed our standards for technical quality. And they submitted a document to us on September 1st. We gave it an initial technical check to make sure that it passed our standards as an initial check. And then we provided it to the public. and that started the public comment period. You can see we're there at the public meeting. Once the public comment period ends, we will complete our review of the document. We will consider all of the public comments that we have received, and then we will issue a certification that either accepts or rejects the landfill's preferred alternative of what to do with the waste and how to prevent this from happening again. And as part of that, we do intend to respond to all substantive public comments. All right, we're going to switch gears now. We're going to talk about the landfill itself and start to piece together what was in these documents. In the yellow box, you can see that's where the chemical waste management facility is located. It's about 6 miles from the Columbia River, and again, 5 or 6 miles from the town of Arlington. The shallowest water underneath the landfill is about 160 feet below the landfill surface today, or about 80 feet below the base of the landfill. The regional aquifer that people use for irrigation is several hundred feet below that. And the age difference between these two aquifers, so that the two bodies of water are not connected. The risk assessment describes how that shallow aquifer under the landfill moves toward the southeast, as you can see, and it flows into a canyon where it is expected that it evaporates before it has a chance to actually daylight and seep and produce a surface water body. In green, you can see the landfill segments where it was known that the T-norm waste was disposed. These cells also take legally acceptable hazardous chemical waste, which is the business of the landfill. The total mass of the T-norm waste, as I mentioned, is approximately 2.5 million pounds. What I learned from talking with DEQ and with the landfill is that on average, in a month, the landfill will accept 15 to 20 million pounds of waste. So just to give you a sense of perspective and scale there. As I said, the landfill is designed to be a hazardous chemical waste landfill. And as a result, there are several features of the landfill that are designed to safely contain those wastes for a very long time. Those include multiple liners at the bottom of the landfill. You can see there are 2 liners that are heavy duty plastic, essentially very thick, and then a third one right where there's a sump. And so any leachate that percolates through the waste is collected by that sump and then managed separately. As they're filling the landfill, it is open to the environment. However, once they're finished, the plan is to install a cap over the landfill that is kind of a keep dry cap. It sheds water, but it also then absorbs water to be evaporated later. And that's one of the benefits of being in a dry climate, is that it's expected that little to no water would actually enter the landfill once it has been capped. So what you would essentially have in the future is a capsule. And that's important because water is really the thing that moves waste over long time frames. What you see here is a map of the locations within the landfill, specifically where the T-norm waste was disposed. They have an approximation that for every point, there's a 25 by 25 foot box where it could be somewhere within that area, but it would be intermingled with other wastes as well. This is another view of those individual locations. In the risk assessment document, there are some cross-section maps, and this is from that document, that gives you a perspective, not only this top-down view, but side views of where the waste is today relative to what the final elevation of the landfill is going to be once it is completely full. And as you can see here, in some of the cross-sections, the waste would be 150 feet below the final elevation of the landfill, pretty deep. However, in other cross sections, you can see that waste would be a little bit closer, not a little bit, it would be closer to the surface of the landfill. The shallowest that the waste would be after closure of the landfill is expected to be 18 feet deep, according to the risk assessment report. So, of all the ones you see there, the shallowest it would be is 18. And here's another view of yet another cross-section. Again, these are in the documents that are on our website if you're interested in seeing specifically where the waste was buried. So we've talked about what the waste is. We've talked about where it is. We've talked about how much it is. Now what I want to talk about is what the risk assessment said about whether and how the waste can pose a risk to human health or the environment under the two different scenarios that are being considered for what to do about the waste. And as I said, those alternatives are to either close it in place or leave the waste where it is and continue operation of the landfill, or to exhume and redispose it somewhere out of state. If the waste were to stay in place, the average depth of the waste would be about 100 feet. But as I said, the shallowest would be, smaller quantities of the waste would be shallow as 18 feet. I also mentioned that the landfill features, the cap and the liner and the dry climate, are intended to prevent migration of these nuclides to the environment. It is also planned that there would be groundwater monitoring underneath the landfill for 30 years post-closure, which is its requirement under its permit from DEQ, and that would be approximately 100 years from today. By contrast, if the decision was to exhume and redispose this waste out of state, it would involve excavating and relocating, so digging up and moving to the side, approximately 680,000 cubic yards of material in order to sift through and look for and find the specific material that was in violation of Oregon law, that mixed T-norm. That would then be trucked out of state. It was assumed that it would be taken to a landfill in Idaho that does accept waste at these concentrations via 322 truck shipments in total. Those are the basics. I'll get into them more in depth. When you're conducting a risk assessment, the method that you're following is essentially what's here on the picture. That in order for a risk to be present, you need to have a source, so radionuclides. You need to have a receptor, which is a person who would be harmed by those radionuclides. And you need to have a pathway. You need to have a way for the radionuclides to reach that person. And you look at a risk assessment is essentially a mathematical model, a complicated equation that tries to replicate what's on this picture. And it looks far into the future. The assessment that we looked at, or that we required, goes out, several 100,000 years in the case of the groundwater assessment. So there's that. Talking about the who. So who are the receptors? Who are the people involved in this risk assessment? It differed depending on which scenario we were looking at. Up at the top, you can see during waste disposal. That was the 3-year period when the waste was originally disposed. And the quote unquote maximally exposed individuals that we looked at for the sake of seeing what the highest possible dose could have been to a person was the waste handler and a current offsite resident. If the waste is left in place, there were a number of scenarios that we looked at for who people might be that could be potentially exposed. That included the landfill worker, the current offsite resident, which is around 2 miles away from the landfill now. A future offsite resident, so long into the future, calculating out what if someone was there after we forget about the landfill, after long into the future. We also required the landfill to include an assessment of a future on-site resident. And that means a person who puts a house on top of the landfill and then draws water from a well at the edge of the landfill. This is a scenario that is very pessimistic. It's a worst case. It assumes that the memory of the landfill is lost sometime in the future, and that the law would prohibit this from happening because of land use controls somehow lapse. But we wanted to see anyway. We wanted to see what the potential risk could be. We went even one step further and said, okay, let's put a person on top of the landfill, have them build a house, have them drink water, but they're going to drill their well straight through the landfill, and they're going to puncture some of this radioactive material, bring it up to the surface, spread it, and use it in the foundation of their house. I think we went pretty pessimistic on that one. For the excavation and removal alternatives, we included the excavation worker, so the person actually operating the equipment that's excavating the material, a supervisor, which really the difference between those is where they're standing and what their exposure could be based on where they're standing at the landfill, as well as that current offsite resident who could potentially be exposed because of inhalation of particulates, as things are being mobilized and dust being transported. So that was the who. Starting now with some of the results. This slide relates to the workers and the public during the original period of disposal from 2016 to 2019. As mentioned in the slide, that maximally exposed worker was the waste handler, which was the truck driver and trailer operator who was disposing of the waste at the landfill. Our understanding from the document was that this would not have been a waste management employee, but this would have actually been an employee of the transportation company that brought it to Oregon. The risk assessment calculated that the maximum dose to this person, if they had been present for every one of the disposals over that 3-year period, so there was no trading of drivers, there was none of that, that if that person was there every time, their maximum dose would have been 3.3 millirem total. Now, what does that mean? Well, we all living on Earth and in America, our average dose that we all receive per year is around 350 millirem. That comes from outer space, that comes from the ground beneath our feet, that comes from, medical procedures add beyond. There are many sources that are all around us. So 350 a year. We also know from studies that have been done via the UN and international community, the EPA, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, they have worked to try to equate doses like this with an actual risk of developing a fatal cancer. And if you were to take that equation that they came up with and apply it to this 3.3 millirem total, you would get a result of 2.4 times 10 to the minus 6, which really means if you're rolling the dice, if it's a probability, it's a 2.5 chance out of 1 million that a person would have contracted cancer from being there at every single disposal. So that's a lot to unpack, but I'm hopefully explaining that correctly there to you all. They did a similar, the technical team from the landfill did a similar assessment of what the potential risk and dose could have been to the offsite resident who lives a couple miles away. And their dose was 7/10 millionths, so 7.6 times 10 to the minus 7 of a millirem. So millirem was a 2 million chance of cancer. This was, a 10 millionth of a millirem. So essentially 0. So that was the 3-year period there. Now on to the leave-in place alternative. This is alternative 1. This is if the waste stays put. I'm deciding here to focus on that future resident who lives on the landfill because that was the highest one that was calculated in the report. So this is a rendering of what that might look like in cartoon form. And again, note that this would not be legal to do, but it assumes that a person lives in a house 350 days a year, day and night. So they are inside that house or around the property all but 2 weeks of the year. It assumes that they're pulling water from a well at the edge of the landfill that is drawing from that shallow aquifer. And it is also looking at the transport of the radionuclides out of the landfill. And this assessment assumed that the liner doesn't work. And it also assumed the cap fails sooner than it is designed to do, because we really wanted to see under worst case scenarios what the potential risk could be. So again, looking at this, some of the pessimistic assumptions here. Person assumed to reside in the house 350 days a year straight for 30 years. They're drawing water from that well, but in reality, the water is not potable. It's not safe to drink as it is today just because of the solids in the water, not because of contamination. And the flow of that aquifer is not high enough. It does not have enough quantity to support a family. So we're ignoring those and assuming that a person drinks it anyway. Also, I wanted to point out here on this slide that based on the modeling that was done of transportation of radionuclides to the groundwater, the moment that the leachate from the landfill touches the aquifer, that leachate would be below the drinking water standard, the federal drinking water standard of what is safe to drink. And the moment that it hit the aquifer, it would be diluted by the water that is already there. But you don't have to rely on dilution in order for that water to be safe to drink if it was in fact drinkable due to all these other factors. That was a point I wanted to make sure I made. So if you put all this together, you say you have a future resident who's living on the landfill in the house, they're drinking water, contrary to what is real. We also assumed that the T-norm itself, there were two different scenarios for the T-norm. One in which it was 90 picocuries per gram, or the average based on the laboratory results that were received by the landfill. And it's a weighted average. And they did another one, which was more pessimistic and said, what if all the waste was equivalent to the highest lab result that the landfill received, which was 143 picocuries per gram. So if you assume the higher one for all of the waste, and if you assume that the T-norm is concentrated all in one spot rather than spread across the landfill, and if you assume that the cap and the liner degrade faster than expected, all these compounding worst case scenarios together, the maximum possible risk to a future resident on the landfill would be up to 1 in a million, 1 e to the -6. Here you can see the results of the groundwater analysis, the groundwater modeling of the nuclides through the zone between the landfill and the aquifer, and what the concentrations in the aquifer would be over time. And what this found was that the maximum drinking water dose, to a resident would be 0.1 millirem a year. So very low number, 1 in a million. And the time of when that would happen is 260,000 years from today. So the radionuclides in the landfill would move very slowly through the environment. And again, it assumes that the aquifer is actually potable in a sufficient quantity, which is not the reality. Moving on to the even more pessimistic scenario where you have someone who's living on the landfill and they drill through the waste and then spread that to make the foundation of their home. All the same pessimistic assumptions that were used in the previous, this just adds some extra waste directly underfoot. And that increased the risk to a 6 in 1 million probability of cancer. This slide, it's in scientific notation. It's a little bit obscure, but what it shows is the summary of the risks of the leave-in-place alternative for all of the receptors, all of the WHO. And I'm going to focus just on the center column, that maximum source term, and that is, as I mentioned before, 143 picocuries per gram, whereas the one on the right is the average, which one could argue is the more realistic, and that one was 90. But I'm going to focus on the maximum. The risk to the landfill worker, that 2e to the -16 is equivalent to 2 in 10 quadrillion. For the current offsite resident, that risk is equivalent to 6 in 10 quintillion. The future offsite resident is around 8 in 10 million risk. The future onsite is the one that we've already discussed. That's 1 in a million. And the future intruder, that's one where they drill through the landfill. That's 6 in a million. So that will hopefully help you see the scale that we're talking about here. And that is alternative 1 and the risk that was calculated associated with that. Moving on now to alternative 2, excavation and redisposal of the waste out of state. As I mentioned before, this would involve excavating 680,000 cubic meters of waste in order to get to the approximately 3,000 cubic meters of waste that we're actually chasing. You would have to, as part of this process, as you're digging into the ground, you're going to encounter macro boxes where hazardous waste has been placed. You're going to encounter barrels. You're going to encounter just bulk granular materials. And so you're going to have to break through the barrels very carefully, break down the boxes to move the waste, to sift things around. It's a careful procedure. And the workers would have to be using supplied air, so air tanks and that sort of thing, and full safety gear, full protective equipment in order to be doing this kind of work. As they would be moving the waste, they find the waste they're looking for, they put it aside in a separate dumpster. As those dumpsters get full, they're sent off to presumably Idaho, total of 322 truckloads. The report estimates that this process would take approximately 10 years to complete. They also looked at the risk to the workers, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the general classes of risk would be from potential radiation exposure as you're re-excavating these materials, as well as the risks associated with the other materials in the landfill, the chemical hazardous waste. And what could happen is you disturb them as they're mixed together potentially, as well as physical injuries from just operating heavy equipment, potential vehicle accidents from all these extra trucks on the road. So those are the kinds of risks that we're talking about here. Estimated cost of the action is approximately $210 million. What you see here is a top-down elevation diagram. It's a rendering of the extent of what would have to be removed in the landfill in order to access the known locations of the Timor waste. Again, a top-down view. So you can see you have to get it pretty spread out in order to have an appropriate slope of layback so that you don't have it collapsing in on itself, this big hole that you're digging, as well as a way for your vehicles to have access when you get down there. From a side view, I mean, it almost looks like mountaintop removal, the extent of the landfill volume that would have to be removed. And here is a rendering of what that excavation process that I described earlier would look like, where you would have heavy equipment on the landfill, moving waste around, seeking the stuff that you're trying to then move out of state. Here you can see they did similar calculations. The technical team from the landfill did similar calculations of what the potential risks would be to the receptors under this scenario. So the excavation worker and their supervisor were the highest, and that was 3.5 in 10,000, or in other words, 35 times higher than the landfill resident, the person who lived in a house on top. Still within the risk range that's acceptable under the Superfund program, but it is higher. I also note that the risk here, they only looked at the radiation side of the risk because there are too many unknowns about what the potential risks from excavating into a chemical waste landfill could be. However, we did ask them to qualitatively do a search around the country for experiences from when people have had to dig into landfills in the past, and looking especially for instances where there have been hazardous waste in the landfill to try to get a sense of what the potential risks could be under an excavation scenario. I'm not saying that these would happen. I'm saying that they are qualitatively risks that we would have to consider. And these include reactivity, so mixture of chemicals together, which could then generate toxic gases, heat, fire can and does happen in landfills, or explosion, dispersion, spills, or other mobilization of waste, where if you have a waste in a barrel and then you puncture that barrel, how do you then recontain that waste to get that extra layer of protection? Acute chemical exposures risks, chronic exposure risks, so things that don't happen immediately but might occur over time. There are also, as I mentioned, physical risks involved with worker injury from operating the heavy equipment, traffic accidents, et cetera, as well as the report did calculate greenhouse gas contributions, which were 11,000 tons of CO2. So I've now talked about the two alternatives that were considered in the risk assessment and the corrective action plan. And we required the landfill to put forward a preferred alternative. And as you may be able to guess, their preferred alternative, based on the comparative risks and the comparative costs for them, was to have a preferred alternative of alternative one, leaving the waste in place. And that is what they have said would be the path of least harm. I'm also including this comparative cost assessment, which came from our agency does not weigh the relative cost of the alternatives heavily when we're considering what is the best and safest alternative. However, it is a data point. It's something to consider. It's something that I wanted to make sure that you all had a chance to see. That the cost of the in-place closure alternative is estimated to be approximately $540,000, whereas the excavate and redispose, as I said before, $210 million. Now, why is the in-place closure $500,000? Well, that cost accounts for additional groundwater modeling for monitoring for radionuclides. So sampling the water to make sure that there aren't radionuclides getting into the environment, which because it's a hazardous waste landfill, was not something that they were previously doing, but are now committing to do. It also involves the installation of a new piece of machinery at the landfill, which is intended to catch radioactivity coming into the site. So now I want to turn to that betterment that I mentioned at the beginning, how waste management and us are getting better at how we do business to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And there are two main pieces to this effort here. The first one is a human process, and that is that so waste management has done an audit of all the waste that come into their site, some 6,000 profiles of different waste from different customers. And any of them that come from a process or that for any reason look like they might involve this natural radioactivity being concentrated, this TNOR, they now require the generator of that waste to take a sample and send it to a lab to find out what's actually in it, how much radioactivity and how hot. They then provide that lab analysis to our agency, to me, and to Tom and to Max. And they say, we think this looks good. Do you concur? So we check out the lab reports. We make sure there's nothing that looks off. We ask questions about the representativeness of the samples that were taken. And if it looks good to us, we provide our concurrence that, yes, this looks like it is legal to dispose of in the state of Oregon. That is the first step. The second step involves what you can see on your screen there, which is a drive-through portal monitor. This is an automated radiation detector that as you drive through, if it detects any radioactivity in your load, it shoots off an alarm. And Waste Management is proposing that every truck coming to landfill would drive through one of these now. They would install it, and they've chosen not one of the cheap ones either. And they would drive through, and if it alarms, they know, okay, well, our human process must have missed something. So they stop the truck, they do an investigation, they figure out what's in the load that tripped the alarm, and they're going to contact us and consult and make sure that either this is appropriate to dispose of in the state or it's not, and it has to be turned around. So by these two factors working together, we think that this is the best protection that we can come up with to make sure that the law is being followed into the future. So what happens next? As I mentioned, as others have mentioned in the beginning, we're still considering the analysis that was provided, as well as going to be considering any public comments that come in. And that public comment period ends November 8th. After considering public input, we're going to accept or reject the preferred alternative, including those additional monitoring and preventative actions. We're going to respond to all substantive comments from the public. And then there's a parallel effort going on right now, which I know some members of our rulemaking advisory committee are on the webinar today. But we have initiated an effort both with the legislature and through our own rulemaking to update our radioactive waste rules. Not only the rules for how we assess penalties and dictate corrective actions if something like this were to happen again, but also to make sure that our definition of radioactive waste is up to the current times and is able to respond to new types of waste, like fracking waste, that frankly were not prevalent in the 70s when laws were first put forward. So I'd like to offer some closing thoughts, and then we'll open it up to questions and comments. Thank you for sticking with me through a lot of information. brought to you fast. It's all contained in those reports that are available on our website. I encourage you to go read them yourselves. And if you have questions, please reach out to us. We're happy to talk with people about what all this means. But for me, I've really struggled over the last several months. What does this all mean? How do we make sense of what's being presented to us? And there's a simple way to look at it that I find helpful, and you may or you may not. But the way I think of it, the radionuclides we're talking about now came from the ground. They came from the ground somewhere else, and they were concentrated. And then they were brought to Oregon and spread back out and put back in the ground. They came out of the ground in one place and went back in the ground in another. And we've done the math, we've done the assessment, and we've found that the waste where it is will not be a risk to anyone at any time in the future, as far as we can know. So what we would be left with is a word, radioactivity. It's a word we didn't want. It's a word that didn't meet our standards, but it's a word that would not be dangerous. From my perspective, from the review that I've conducted so far, from the discussions with our team, I do think that the risk assessment and the corrective action do make a good technical supporting case that leaving the waste in place is probably going to be the path of least harm. What we're hoping to learn from you, though, is, are there considerations we've missed? I can only see my own perspective. So is there something we missed, or is this something you can live with? And that's why we're coming to you now. That's why we're seeking your comment and your questions. With that, again, thank you for your time. I will release this back to Jenny, and we'll open it up for discussion. Thank you.
Actually, Jeff, if you want to leave that up, that may be helpful, because then folks can see the public comment email address.
Okay.
I also went ahead and put it in the chat so folks can find it there, as well as a link to our website where a PDF of Jeff's presentation is available, and we will post the meeting recording on our website, hopefully by the end of the week. It takes a little bit for it to download, but we should have that available for you. Jeff, we don't have any comments that have come in so far in the chat, but I let folks know that I would unmute all participants in case somebody does want to jump in and ask a question, or if they have a comment. So for all participants, this is your warning. I'm about to manually unmute you. And once I do that, you will have control over your own mute button. It is at the bottom of your screen. So if you don't want to say anything, please feel free to re-mute yourself. And then at that point, you'll be able to unmute yourself if you would like to weigh in later. So a fair warning, I'm about to unmute everybody. Okay, everyone unmuted, so please mute yourself. Or if anyone has a question or please go ahead and speak up.
This is Shirley Weathers. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Is it true that I'm the only person on the call besides you three?
Hi, Shirley. Great question. Some other participants there are about 39 folks to attend. For some reason, our system doesn't allow us to the attendees.
Jennifer, you are really breaking up. I really didn't hear anything you said.
Oh, I apologize.
No, it's okay.
Can you hear me now?
Well, I can hear you, but I didn't. I mean, you go in and you're breaking up, and so I didn't hear. There are other participants besides me.
Yes, there are.
Okay.
Shirley, are you?
Yeah, I heard you fine, and Jennifer was fine until she unmuted everybody.
I see.
Seems like.
It may be because there's some feedback from the lines. I'm trying to go unmute everybody. Can you hear me now? Okay.
not really. Sorry. I do have a few questions, but will you sort of tell me when to stop so that if someone else wants to ask a question, they can do so? Yes?
Shirley, sure. Go ahead.
One of the things that came up during the March hearings was the potential pathway created by the spraying of leachate for dust control that is reportedly done. It isn't, as far as I could see, it's not considered in the risk assessment that Chemical Waste Management submitted. Can you talk about that as the spraying of leachate? I understand. I don't know, but I'm told that it doesn't happen. It's not done at sites where there is this kind of waste. Can you just talk about that as a potential pathway that wasn't considered, or that you could consider now for us?
Sure. Shirley, could you mute your phone while I talk, please? Is that possible?
I just muted her. I think that may
Okay,
also.
great. Yeah, Shirley, I think it might have been feedback on your line that was creating the issue here. The leachate question was addressed via a separate document that is on our website that we asked for in advance of the risk assessment. I think it came out in May, where they looked at their leachate management practices. They sampled the leachate itself to figure out if it was above or below our standards for what we would call radioactive material. And I have to admit and apologize, it's been a while since I read it, but my recollection was that it was not above our standards there. And gosh, it's one of those things where I haven't heard what you were describing, where this is not a standard practice in other landfills. If you have more information about that, I'd love to hear more. I guess all I can do right now is refer you to the leachate report. And if you want to talk about it more specifically, I'm happy to talk with you. I might just need a little bit of time to reread it again to make sure that we're speaking the same language.
Shirley, I just want to.
Okay, yeah, it must be when you unmute me that it creates the problem with me hearing you. One of the issues, one of the criteria is community acceptance for as part of your decision making. As I read that, can you talk about what role community acceptance plays in your decision? And I guess I should stop and say right at the outset that I really can't see any possible way that alternative one isn't what we should do. I mean, alternative two looks like a total nightmare as far as risk and danger and cost, but primarily the former concerns. But I just, the community's interest here is, I think, something that is of great concern to the League of Women Voters. And I certainly heard a lot of concerns from the public, the community in March. So can you talk about what role community acceptance, what does it look like when they accept, and just discuss that, how this community feels about being made against their will, a radiologic zone, and it's going to stay that way.
Okay. So the community acceptance criteria comes from the Superfund program. CERCLA is the law, and it dictates 9 criteria that risk managers and decision makers are to consider when looking at what is the best alternative in a given situation. And Superfund law looks at environmental contamination issues of all kinds across the country. It has what are known as threshold criteria and modifying criteria. The threshold criteria are really the effectiveness, the implementability of an action, how well it's going to work in the long term and how well it's going to work in the short term. Those are the really, rubber hits the road risk type criteria. And if an alternative doesn't meet one of those threshold criteria, then it can be excluded from further consideration. Community acceptance is within the bucket of modifying criteria, where if there are aspects of an alternative, this is my interpretation, if there are aspects of an alternative that a community does not accept or finds a problem, are there ways you can modify your alternative to better address community concerns? I don't know that I can say right now whether community acceptance or lack of acceptance would be something that the state would say is reason to put people at potentially much greater risk. And I can't say it's not my decision to make. To your point though about this landfill being a radiological zone, I just want to say that from my perspective, this is not a radioactive waste landfill. It is not going to be a radioactive waste landfill. We are saying that emphatically. We have issued the notice of violation because we do not accept that this will be a radioactive waste landfill, and we are requiring these corrective actions, these preventative measures, because we want to make sure that stays that way. And frankly, Waste Management wants it to stay that way too. They don't want the trouble of this. And while it is true that our Oregon law says you can't establish a radioactive waste disposal facility, where we are now is we've issued the notice of violation, and now we're in the corrective action space where we're trying to just figure out what is the best path forward. I know that some people may see that differently from the way I see it, but again, I do not see this as a radioactive waste landfill. There's just not enough stuff there to be a problem. I hope I'm not saying something bad there.
Thanks, Jeff. Shirley, I'm going to come back and unmute you in case you have follow-up, and then we do have one other participant with their hand raised. So we'll, Aaron Saylor, we'll get to you in just a second, but I'm going to unmute Shirley one more time.
Okay, thank you, and thank you all. Thank you, Jeff. Your presentation has been really clear and thorough, and I've really appreciated being able to, having you do such a good job of explaining what all of this means in lay terms. So I think that is all the questions I have right now, but I do want to thank you very specifically for making it very clear that what has happened here over this 3-year period cannot in any way result in I suppose there could be a legislative decision that would overturn what you've just said in terms of guaranteeing that this is not going to become a radioactive landfill because of what's happened. So appreciate that, and appreciate all of your emphasis that will be ODO's goal. Thank you.
Thanks, Shirley. Okay, Aaron Saylor, I'm going to come up and unmute you next.
Hi, this is Erin Saylor with Columbia Riverkeeper. I wanted to thank you also for your presentation today. This has been really informative. My question does echo what Shirley's concerns that she just raised having to do with the leachate. I will go back and look at that document that you just indicated was on the website closer, but I know from conversations with some of our other staff that the radionuclide concentrations in the leachate already exceed EPA's maximum concentration limits, and we're troubled that the corrective action plan doesn't seem to account for the potential that the leachate could become more concentrated and more radioactive over time as it recycles through the landfill. And the fact that they have the system where they do spray it up on the surface for dust suppression, it seems to introduce the possibility that everything that's kind of, concentrating down at the bottom is then being pulled back up to the top, which could put workers and other folks at risk up on the surface. And kind of similar to that, it seems like my read of the corrective action plan is that it's only proposing radioactivity testing be conducted every 5 years, while VOCs and PCB testing happens semi-annually. So because of this concern that the radioactivity levels could be concentrating and the fact that it's sprayed at the surface, we do have concerns about that 5-year testing timeframe.
Okay. Thank you, Erin. I'll look at that. I think you make a good point. We'll have to make sure we understand what that frequency is and what it should be. I did want to respond to a couple of things in addition to what I'd already said to Shirley. Regarding the worker risk and the spraying, I believe that is addressed in the leachate report specifically. So I would direct you to that. And if it doesn't answer your questions, again, please give us a call. The question about the leachate at the bottom being above an EPA standard today, on one hand, all I can say is that's not our standard, that's EPA's, but the real point I want to make is that what we're looking at right now is the landfill during its operational years. We're looking at it when open to the environment, when there is more liquid that is able to get into the waste to then leach. What you would have during the period that the risk assessment is looking at is a post-closure period where the waste has been dried out. You have the liner and you have the cap, and there would be a period of time where they continue to draw out whatever leachate manages to reach the bottom after they've capped it. So what you would be left with for the long term is a dry capsule. And so the modeling in the risk assessment starts from that assumption that you have a dry capsule, and that the leachate issue that we're seeing today is apples and oranges, that they're not really related at all. And so what it looks at in the risk assessment is any future moisture from the environment coming in, reaching waste, and moving it through. I would offer that, and if there are additional points or considerations beyond that, to again, please contact us or make a comment so that we can provide a fuller response.
Thanks, Jeff. At the moment, we don't have any other comments coming through, and I don't see any other hands raised. But if other folks want to weigh in with questions or comments, please feel free to unmute yourselves. We can hang on for another couple minutes in case somebody is still ruminating on something. And I'll put a little more information in the chat with another link to our website and some information about tonight's meeting in Arlington. I just see a comment from Jessica Douglas that she's not able to unmute herself. So Jessica, I will unmute you and please feel free to speak up.
Oh, hi. Yeah, my name is Jessica Douglas. I am just concerned. I'm wondering what sort of outreach are you doing to further the conversation with the Warm Springs tribe, as well as I know that you presented to their tribe in March. And so I just wanted to know what you're doing to make these more accessible, to make sure their concerns are also heard.
Thank you. This might be one that Max or Janine or Jenny want to chime in with. But we have reached out to the Warm Springs tribe when this document was put out to the public and offered that if they would like to have a conversation with us about what it says and what it means, we're happy to accommodate that. So we have done outreach in the present period here. Max or anyone else, would you like to add?
I think that does cover it, Jeff. I believe reached out. Oh, it looks like I just got a message from Janine. She got kicked off of WebEx, unfortunately. But yes, I know that we did reach out directly to some of our tribal partners and offered up the meetings. I don't believe we've heard back yet or that they've been scheduled, but we will follow up with them.
Awesome, thank you. And then I just was wondering if you could touch a little bit more on the groundwater monitoring. Will that be occurring while the company is still open, or as well as once the facility closes?
Both. So they currently do groundwater monitoring, both upstream and downstream, if you will, or up gradient and down gradient of the landfill, so that they can identify whether there's anything new that is hitting the water aquifer right there underneath. They do that right now while they're in operation, and their permit with the Department of Environmental Quality, who does oversee the landfill, requires them to continue doing monitoring 30 years post-closure. So after they've dried it out, after there's a cap and all of that, to see if there are any stragglers, essentially. That's where the requirement stands.
And then how often was that occurring, or is that occurring currently? Or how often is that occurring right now?
I would have to check. I'm sorry, I don't have that information right off the top of my head. That if you would like to make that as a comment, we can certainly check with Waste Management, because they're really the ones who know this, what their own program is, and get an answer to you. I can't recall if that's currently in the corrective action plan or not. I would have to go look. Sorry, I wish I had a better answer for you right here and now.
That's okay. Thank you.
Thanks. Oh, I'm seeing a response from Tom Cecilia, who is our hydrogeologist. He's on our team. He said that it varies by chemical, that the frequency of monitoring is somewhere between 6 months and every couple of years, depending on what they're looking for. So I hope that helps.
Is there not a concern to increase that monitoring now that there is this presence of, radioactive waste in the landfill? Is that something that's considered a potential to change?
I think that yes. I think that there could be consideration for that to change, specific to the nuclides that we are looking for. And if you think that there should be a different frequency of monitoring than what is in the plans, and again, this is a good note for me that I need to include that in my presentation, more about what this monitoring would be. But please bring those concerns to us, and we will look at that in our response to Waste Management about what kind of monitoring is needed.
Thank you. Sorry, I'll stop asking questions because there's probably other people.
Shirley has her hand raised again, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, Shirley. And I'm hearing that there might be a person on the phone who is trying to comment, so I'm going to unmute the phone participants after Shirley's question, so hang tight.
Thanks. I just have a quick factual question. I didn't catch what you said, Jeff, the greenhouse gas impact was determined to be.
Yes. Sorry, Jenny, could you please? There we go. In the corrective action plan, they calculated it would be 11,000 tons of CO2 involved in the excavation alternative. And I think that's from the heavy equipment and the trucks.
Shirley, I'm going to unmute you one more time just in case you got a follow-up before I go to the person on the phone. Okay, I didn't hear anything. Okay, so I believe I have the correct phone number now, so I apologize for the people on the phone. It sounds like they may be having trouble unmuting, but I believe there's a Scott on the phone who has a comment or a question, and I'm going to unmute you now, Scott, and hopefully we will be able to hear you.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I was wondering if you're going to check the folks that are just waiting on the phone. Thank you. Yes, my name is Scott Forster, and I just have some questions here. Maybe I could just go ahead and make those one at a time, and if you want to chime in, let me know. First off, the radioactive socks. You mentioned that 80% of the waste that was dumped illegally was filter socks. What's the other 20%?
The other 20% includes pipe scale, so the stuff that sticks on the inside of pipes, sludges from the bottom of tanks, that settle out. I'm trying to think what some like random debris or personal protective equipment from the oil fields, that kind of thing. I'm trying to think. I think that was all of the ones in the list.
All right, yeah. So the pipe scale, that's the most radioactive of all when it comes to the oil field workers. That's the worst. The pipe scale is even worse than the filter socks in terms of concentrated radioactivity. Also, just to mention that there's radioactive lead-210, bismuth-210, polonium-210, as well as radium-228 and 226, and the daughter byproducts, as you said, of the decay series of the thorium and radium, and of course the radon that you mentioned. The thing is, you started out by saying that you have an open mind. Now, your name is Jeff. What's your last name?
Burright, sir.
Yeah, and you're a lawyer for Waste Management Incorporated?
No, I work for the Oregon Department of Energy in the Nuclear Safety Division.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's just the way you were speaking, I thought you were like a proponent of waste management. I apologize.
No, I'm just trying to represent what the documents say.
Well, I guess you faithfully represented the perspective of Waste Management Incorporated through their subsidiary. You did say that you wish that, I think this is a quote, I wish we could prevent the laws from being broken. I make a point that this was a citizen, apparently from North Dakota, calling anonymously and alerting the state of Oregon that this violation had been happening for months and years. If that person had never called, we could conceivably have been taking more radioactive waste with no intervention, because apparently we don't even have so much as a Geiger counter, which they had since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There's at least been Geiger counters out there, and the idea that a multi-million-dollar corporation doesn't even have a Geiger counter to check just to see. It's as if this T-norm, which, by the way, the acronym T-norm shouldn't be used for laypersons. You should actually spell out what it means. So it really shows how inside baseball you are. You need to come outside the bubble to regular folks that might actually be reading these documents. The idea is back to this thing here about laws being broken. We have no way of knowing that radioactive waste wasn't disposed before this. Again, if it wasn't for that tip, we might have been accepting this waste, but then it concerns me that ever since this facility has been opened, if we've had no consistent testing, and apparently the checks and balances of which there would appear to be little to none within the corporation to try to find radioactive potential waste, the idea is that we could literally have hot spots all throughout the dump. Before I let you answer, I just want to say I do support what you said. The total cost of cleaning up what's in there would cost $210 million and take 10 years, and I support that perspective. That actually sends a message to this corporation traded on Wall Street, making money off of dumping in Oregon, that they actually have to follow the rules, even rules that maybe, with all due respect to your agency, haven't maybe did its job properly. The fact is the laws were on the books, and that's a company that apparently missed it for potentially years and maybe multiple occasions, not just this one. Go ahead, sir.
Okay. I appreciate what you're saying. Especially, I don't want to sound like
but I'm looking forward to your comment.
Like baseball. So I take that one to heart. I do want to respond. There's one piece that I do want to respond to here, where you had talked about, could this have been happening with all other kinds of waste for years? One of the things that has been going on since the spring, Waste Management has gone through all of their active profiles. They've gone back to 2008 when their electronic system first started, and they've gone looking for other wastes that could have potentially had TNORM in them. They have been auditing all of their generators and having them sample all of their wastes as kind of a catch-up and sending that through to us. And so far, we have not seen anything that is above what we would call radioactive waste from these other sources that could have potentially been this technologically enhanced, naturally occurring radioactive material.
Well, thank you for that comment. Yeah, so I stand at what I said is that we really don't know, and you're looking at a database going to 2008. That's apparently the digitized database, and apparently there were hand-kept records prior to that. So we just really don't know the characterization of the waste. If we go in with the proposed actual cleanup, where we go in and get all of the radioactive waste, and it may take 10 years and $210 million and maybe more with cost overruns, that we may actually encounter other radioactive waste as well and really true get a characterization of what's going on here. But perhaps the state doesn't want to actually do that, but that's what I would recommend. I do have a few more things here. So on this idea, I think need to take a satellite view. You're very good at talking about picocuries per liter of this and that and per gram. Let's take a look at this. Back in the 70s, the citizens of the state of Oregon, both Republicans and Democrats, put a law on the books that said no radioactive dumping in Oregon. We don't have a radioactive dump in Oregon. And you yourself said that, quote, it's not going to be a radioactive landfill. It's not going to become a radioactive landfill, and it never will. I think I characterized that well. Well, the thing is, it is right now. We are a radioactive dump. We got it happen. So for 50 years, we were fine, but apparently the Oregon Department of Energy and its personnel within never even conceptualized that there would be a possibility of low-level radioactive waste being dumped in a facility. That seems ludicrous, that for 50 years there was no discussion that this could be a possibility and that we would take preventive actions only after we got a tip, again, from an anonymous citizen, that if we did not have that tip, we wouldn't be here discussing today. So the thing is, I mentioned one of your other commenters said maybe in the future that there could be a proposal of a law to have a radioactive waste dump. Now, this basically is a foot in the door. So we'll be able to say when the dust settles here, so to speak, we'll be able to say, well, you know, we dealt with that, so it's a one-off. But what you really done is set a precedence as well, which is, hey, there could be a really great lobbyist that says, you know, we already have like 2.5 million pounds of radioactive waste in there already. Why don't we go ahead and make it a low-level radioactive waste repository? And you never know what the vagaries of politics are in the future, that maybe they say, hey, we can manage it and make a lot of money, and that's jobs, high-paying jobs, managing the United States radioactive waste from all these closed nuclear power plants. So why wouldn't that be a possibility?
I don't really know how to answer that other than just to say it's a good consideration, what you bring up.
Well, that's good. I would like you to consider it in writing. In addition, it says the company has gotten better too. That's interesting that you're talking for the state, which means you're talking for me and other citizens, and the many tens of thousands of citizens that are not even participating. But technically, you're in our corner. And yes, really, frankly, the company should be speaking for itself, not you. And I'm really kind of dismayed that why the company isn't making their own pitch, and that you should actually be the neutral party. But frankly, with all due respect, the way you made a pitch, it was biased in favor of the company's preferred alternative. And that, I think, is putting your finger on the scale. And so maybe, you know, I'm just letting you know, I think that right is ripe for legal challenge, because frankly, the state should be a neutral party in this. Let's see. It says we talked to South Dakota and another state about something that similar happened. What was the other state?
Kentucky.
And what was the response by them? What did they do?
Well, their legal structure is different from ours. They pursued penalties against the landfill and several other entities that were involved. They performed a risk assessment as well, and their ultimate decision was in place, leaving the waste where it was.
Thank you. So that's that's what we're coming at. We're going to follow the lead of Kentucky with Mitch McConnell, the head of the Senate. We're going to follow Kentucky's lead. I never thought, Oregon would follow Kentucky, nor follow South Dakota. Two states not known to be leaders in environmental compliance. So actually, I do have pride in the state of Oregon. We may not be perfect, but I think we do things pretty darn good, but we can always have room for improvement. A message needs to be sent. And the message that needs to be sent is that if you actually take a law that heretofore, as far as we know, had never been violated in a half century, and it was violated, and only for, thank God, a tip from a citizen that we found out that this dump was happening, that we are going to take the most stringent measures possible. You want to hit a company that makes billions of dollars, Waste Management Incorporated and their subsidiary, Chemical Waste Management, $210 million is more like the ticket. Now, those are dangerous jobs. You mentioned risk. There's risk in everything, including burying chemical waste. Well, you know what? There's also a risk to the idea that Oregon makes laws and that laws should be followed, and that we're a state that can basically dumped on, right? Dumped on, in this case, radioactive dumping, and then we're not going to do anything about it. We're just going to call it a cost of doing business. And this $500,000 concept of getting some radioactive Geiger counter or something to test incoming stuff, that needs to be done anyway, but that is like a pittance. But $210 million, there's going to be a lot of high-paying jobs. People are going to have scuba gear. They're going to be well-trained. It's going to take 10 years. That's 10 years of high-income jobs. They're probably union jobs. There's going to be a lot of activity there. And also, every single day that those workers are out there, Waste Management Incorporated and Chemical Waste Management will be thinking to itself, you know what, we're never going to do that mistake again. Any comments, sir?
No, I don't have any comment on what you've said here.
Yeah, I didn't expect that you would have a comment, but I would like a comment in writing. And then I guess in closing, first, thank you for your time and allowing me to speak. You mentioned that there'll be 30 years of post-closure monitoring. I think that's a fair quote. That's interesting. Now with radionuclides, some of them of which have half-lives of up to tens of thousands of years, including the radium series, that means that post-closure monitoring should be forever. It's interesting that in your comments, I don't have the exact quote, but you said, you have a scenario like as if we forgot about it and somebody builds a house on it. It's conceivable that 100 years from now, the vast majority of people might have forgotten about it. Maybe not everyone. But the idea is that, if you only have 30 years and you can bolt, 30 years post-closure, you said be about 100 years from now. Well, I would like to think we're thinking 6 generations ahead, right? If we really want to be good stewards of the earth today, we have to leave something for our great-great-great-grandchildren. And so that means we have to make decisions today, which means that if we're going to leave the radioactive waste, we need to do monitoring perpetual forever. And so that means waste management in whatever entity it exists in the future, because corporations don't have a lifespan, that they should basically be monitored forever as long as they exist on Earth, and then I guess the state would have to monitor. But my first and best proposal is to eliminate this waste, is to go in and spend the 10 years and the $210 million or whatever the cost would be to scientifically, as safe as possible, with high-paying jobs, go in and remove all that waste. So guess what? We don't have to worry about radionuclides getting into our river or leaching and all those other problems, like so many problems. In closing, the Exxon Valdez oil spill, they buried their waste in Oregon. I don't know if you knew that. So of all the places in the world that when the Exxon Valdez was on the news, on TV, no one knew that all of the oil-soaked waste had the privilege of being buried in Oregon, in Arlington. And so that's interesting. We have a great reputation among corporations as a place to do their dumping. And so this now means that radioactive waste, you say, will never happen again. I'm not so sure. So what we're going to do is really send a message as a state, don't dump on us. For 50 years, we had a law that wasn't violated. It's been violated through the negligence of the corporation and somebody who basically tried to make an additional profit by dumping in Oregon and not paying the proper fees for proper disposal. And we're going to send that message by making a tough decision, which is have that company clean up its mess, even if it takes 10 years and $210 million. Any comments, sir?
Actually, if I may, this is Janine. I'm the director at the Oregon Department of Energy. I'm still on the line, and Jeff may have additional comments as well. But I just wanted to pipe in and say I acknowledge and appreciate the frustration experienced by the person on the phone right now. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is an unprecedented situation for all of us, and really it was a wake-up call for the entire state about the need to strengthen our laws and strengthen our program. And that is something that Jeff and his colleagues and the rest of us at the department are taking very seriously. We are working with the legislature to strengthen the laws. We're working with the Rulemaking Advisory Committee to strengthen the rules. And we are certainly open for ideas on other ways to make sure this doesn't happen in the future. And then I just, in terms of the Oregon Department of Energy representing this document from Chemical Waste Management, you are correct. It is their document, and I think what Jeff was trying to do, what Jeff is trying to do, is play the role of helping the public understand what it says. It's a very long and complicated and technically challenging document to understand, and so Jeff trying to make it accessible to the public. And you know, I think we, as he said, have an open mind, would like to hear from the public if there are considerations that we missed. So that is the point of the meeting today. But I really appreciate your comments and thank you for raising them.
Yes, Madam Director, I just want to have a closing comment regarding what you stated. You mentioned that this is unprecedented. So let's put that back on you, and I do appreciate your comments. You know what, unprecedented illegal activity of dumping radioactive waste where there were none before for a half century takes unprecedented action by your agency on behalf of the citizens of Oregon to send a message, an unprecedented message, that you're going to clean it all up, and it's going to cost you a heck of a lot of money, and you're never going to do it again, and it sends a message to all other states so that maybe someday Kentucky and South Dakota will contact us, and they'll say, what did you do? And you said, well, we didn't just say it's okay and take a little fine. We basically said it's not okay, and you're going to clean up your mess, even if it costs you hundreds of millions of dollars and takes tens of years. So that would be unprecedented. So I hear what you're saying, but I challenge you to actually take unprecedented action, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Okay, it doesn't look like anyone else has their hand raised at the moment, but folks should still be able to unmute themselves if they'd like to speak up. Okay, well, I don't see anything else coming in. Jeff and Max, if we want to wrap up the meeting, as folks can see on the screen, the public comment email is available there. I've put in the chat our website address. We have a ton of helpful information on our website. Please drop by. The documents are available there. A PDF of Jeff's presentation is there. And then hopefully by the end of the week, we will have both the meeting recording for this meeting as well as audio for this evening's meeting, hopefully by the end of the week. So please stay tuned and it will all be available on our website. Oh, I'm just seeing one other person just had one last question. Jessica, I will unmute you now.
Oh, I was just wondering how these comments addressed in this public meeting will they be just comments that occur before the Oregon Department of Energy? Will they be stated on the website? What is your plan after these comments have been made? And how can we know that it is being taken into account?
Okay. Thank you. Good question. The plan that we have, and it's certainly open to suggestion, as we gather in comments and gathering in comments from these meetings that are being recorded, the plan would be to produce a document where we do provide written responses to the questions that have been posed. That would be then posted publicly at the same time, as at least the thought at the moment, at the same time that we then do a final response to the chemical waste management landfill about how to close this corrective action. And when we respond to those comments, the plan is to provide a full response. And if it does lead to changes from what has been posted previously, we would include that in the response.
Great. I hope so. Thank you.
I just added into the chat a web address URL for how to sign up for email updates. So if you are not already receiving our email updates, please go ahead and follow that link and sign up for radioactive waste disposal updates. And then when that document that Jeff is talking about is ready and available on our website, we will send an update out so folks can know that it's available and can go check it out.
Well, if there are no other questions or comments, I'd just like to say again, thank you for giving us your time, for following along with all of this.
Janine, Max, any final things to add before we close?
This is Max. I'll just add, sort of a note on the comments itself. We have, as Jenny mentioned, we've recorded this presentation. We'll be able to listen to, and I have been taking notes as we're going along. We'll be able to get the full comments that people have stated, and we can respond to those as Jeff mentioned in that process. I'd also encourage that if anybody on the line would like to submit written comments with either this, information you've stated today or additional information, please do so. That would be great. The way to do that is on the screen right now, odo.comments@oregon.gov, and we will respond to those accordingly. And then just one final note that we again will be in Arlington tonight at the high school football stadium around 6, meeting starting at 6 p.m. And so if people would like to come there, that's where we will be. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks again, everyone, for joining us. We are going to go ahead and close the meeting. Take care.